I remember the autumn of 1896 as if it were yesterday, the season when I first crossed the marsh road toward the Harlow estate. The sky hung low with mist, and the soil clung to my boots like something alive. The air smelled of peat and rain, and though daylight still lingered, the house loomed ahead like the shadow of an ancient grief. It was said the Harlows had ruled that part of Somerset since the old wars, yet the villagers spoke their name as one might speak of the dead, softly, and only when necessary. When I reached the gates, the iron was cold enough to sting my hands. Beyond them, the gravel path disappeared into rows of blackthorn trees. The windows of the manor reflected nothing, no movement, no warmth, no trace of a living soul. Only the faint outline of a woman in the upper corridor, her shape unmoving, as though painted upon the glass. Lady Miriam Harlow received me without a word. Her presence was neither welcoming nor cruel, simply still, as if she had been waiting for a moment too long delayed. She guided me through corridors heavy with the scent of beeswax and dust. The portraits that lined the walls had all been marred, each face erased by a careful, almost reverent hand. Only the eyes remained untouched, staring through the ruin of their features, as if pleading for remembrance. She led me to a chamber overlooking the marshes. The bed was narrow, the sheets untouched. On the desk lay a book bound in cracked red leather. I thought it a ledger, but when I turned its first page, I saw only a family crest drawn in dried ink, a serpent devouring its own tail. That night I slept little. The silence in that house was not the absence of sound, but the weight of something that refused to be spoken. And before dawn, I heard what I believed was rain against the ceiling. But when I rose and touched the window frame, my fingers came away dark. It was not Ra, and by morning the mist had thickened so densely that the manor seemed to drift upon it like a ship lost at sea. I woke to find the fire in my chamber extinguished, though I had fed it well into the night. My breath hung white in the air. Every board beneath my feet groaned, as if reluctant to bear my weight. There was no sign of Lady Miriam, nor any servant to account for the breakfast that had been promised. Only a silver tray stood at the threshold, untouched, spotless, and cold. As I descended the grand staircase, I saw how decay had claimed the house in quiet ways. The portraits wept streaks of mold. The tapestries bowed beneath the damp. Somewhere in the walls, a slow dripping echoed, patient and steady. I followed it through a corridor I did not recall from the night before, narrower, lower, lined with doors that bore no handles. Each one bore a single marking above its lintel, a cross turned downward, scratched into the wood by a blade. At the end of that passage stood a mirror, so tall it reached nearly to the ceiling. Its frame was gilded, its glass unbroken, but its reflection wrong. It did not show me as I was. My hair in the glass was gray, though I was not yet 30. My face hollowed, my eyes sunken deep, and behind me, faint but certain, stood the figure of a woman, her head bowed, her dress the color of dried blood. When I turned, there was nothing. The corridor was empty, silent, but for the distant ticking of that broken clock downstairs. Yet when I looked again at the mirror, the woman remained, closer now, her hand reaching toward the place where my reflection should have stood. I left the hall then, stumbling into the open foyer, my heart laboring as though I had run a great distance. And from the upper floors above me came the soft creak of a door, slow and deliberate, as if someone had just stepped out to watch. I did not sleep the following night. The air in my chamber had grown heavy, thick with the smell of soot and old iron. Every few moments I heard faint movement above the ceiling. Not footsteps exactly, but a dragging sound, as though some weight were being pulled slowly across the attic floor. I told myself it was the timber settling, or perhaps rats in the beams, but lies of comfort have short breath. Near midnight, the wind outside rose, carrying with it the sound of something hollow, like a low chant, caught in the distance and swept across the marsh. I went to the window, and through the haze I saw lights where there should have been none. 3 of them, swaying faintly between the reeds. They moved with purpose, neither flickering nor dimming, as though held aloft by unseen hands. Drawn by that quiet procession, I dressed and took the candle from the desk. The corridors were darker now than I remembered, the air colder. The wax flame guttered each time I passed a doorway, though no draught followed me. At the landing below, I caught sight of Lady Miriam's portrait, one I could have sworn was not there before. Her likeness was rendered in faded oils, yet her eyes were painted so sharply they seemed alive, wet even, as if reflecting light that did not exist. The front doors stood slightly open. Beyond them, the fog rolled in thick folds across the ground, swallowing the lower steps of the estate. The 3 lights were still visible, now closer, moving toward the chapel that lay in ruin behind the orchard. I remember the sound of the hinges as I stepped outside, that long, thin groan of rusted metal, and how the candlelight trembled in my hand, though I held it still. As I neared the edge of the courtyard, one of the lights suddenly faltered, then vanished, leaving only 2, and somewhere deep in the fog, a woman's voice whispered my name, spoken not in greeting, but in warning. I could not tell whether dawn had come, or if the fog had merely thickened into day. The world outside the manor was colorless, the ground soft beneath my boots, as though something within it had begun to rot. The chapel stood where the orchard ended, its stones blackened by age, its bell tower broken, its windows sealed by boards that had long since fused with rust. I approached in silence, carrying what remained of my candle, though it no longer burned. Inside, the air was dry and ancient, as though no breath had been drawn there for centuries. The pews were gone, replaced by a long table draped in rotted velvet. Upon it lay books so old their pages had fused into pulp, and among them a single brass crucifix turned upside down. Behind the altar, a mural stretched across the cracked wall, an image of a woman kneeling before a serpent. The paint had faded, yet the serpent's eyes still glimmered faintly, as if wet. I found her name carved beneath the mural, Miriam Harlow. The year beside it was 1796, a full 100 years before my arrival. Beneath the date, scratched in newer lines, was a phrase half in Latin, half in English. Sanguis pro sanguine. The debt continues. I felt the earth shift beneath my feet. Not a tremor, not movement, but an exhale, deep and long, as though the soil itself had lungs. From somewhere behind the altar came a faint scratching, a rhythmic scrape of metal against stone. I bent closer, and there, through a split in the floor, I saw the edge of a coffin lid, its surface bound with iron clasps that had been wrenched apart. The air turned colder. Something within the box had moved. A subtle shift, the sound of fabric tearing. And then I saw it, a single gloved hand, the same pale shade I remembered from Lady Miriam's greeting, resting gently against the stone. I fled the chapel then, but the fog followed, rising, curling, clay, clinging to my throat. And as I ran toward the house, I heard her voice again, closer now, whispering not my name this time, but the words, "You were chosen too." When I returned to the manor, the doors were already open, though I was certain I had closed them behind me. The candle had burned to its socket, leaving the air thick with the scent of tallow and cold iron. Every corner of that place seemed to watch me, the portraits, the stairwells, even the cracks along the walls that curved like veins beneath dying skin. The silence was unbearable, heavy enough to press against the chest. In the great hall, the mirror from the corridor had been moved. It stood now before the fireplace, tilted slightly forward, as though to observe whoever passed. Its surface no longer held my reflection at all, only the faint shimmer of light, and beneath it, something that pulsed faintly, like breath behind glass. I dared not approach, yet my eyes were drawn to it again and again, as one stares at an open grave knowing the earth will one day receive them too. I called for Lady Miriam then, first softly, then louder, my voice breaking through the stillness. No answer, only the creak of the upper floors, the slow echo of something shifting weight above me. And then, faintly, I heard a melody, a woman's hum, mournful and uneven, like the tail end of a forgotten hymn. It came from the direction of the library. I followed it down the west wing, where the air smelled of damp paper and mildew. The books were swollen with moisture, their spines split open to reveal rot instead of words. Upon the writing desk lay the red leather book I had seen before, but now its pages were filled, lines written in a trembling hand, repeating the same sentence again and again. The pact must not break. The blood remembers. The humming ceased as I touched the book, and from the doorway behind me I caught the faint reflection of movement on the brass of a candlestick, the shape of a woman standing very still, her head inclined toward my shoulder. I turned slowly, praying, eyeing to find no one there. But she was, and in her eyes I saw my own face, older than it had ever been. She did not speak. She only watched me, her breath shallow, her skin pale as candle wax. There was something lifeless in her stillness, and yet I felt her presence like heat, not warmth, but the fever of something long dead that refused to rest. My throat tightened, and I stepped back, but the space behind me felt smaller than it should have been, as though the house itself had drawn closer to listen. Her gloved hands lifted slowly, and I saw that one of them was stained dark, the same dull red that had dripped from my ceiling that first night. She reached toward my chest, her touch stopping inches from my heart, and whispered something I could not at first understand. When I leaned closer, the words became clear. "You bear his name now." The candle in the corner flared suddenly, though no wind stirred. The walls shuddered with a low groan, a sound that seemed to come not from timber, but from the earth beneath the foundation. I stumbled backward, and the woman, Lady Miriam, or whatever remained of her, lowered her hand. Her expression softened for a moment, almost with pity, before her eyes dulled again into that glassy, unblinking stare. I fled from the library into the corridor, but the house had changed. Where doors once stood, there were only panels of blank plaster. The staircase now curved in the opposite direction, leading upward into darkness. I called again, though for whom I cannot say, perhaps for mercy, perhaps for reason. But every echo of my voice returned to me in another tone, older, weaker, as though the walls themselves were repeating what I had yet to become. When at last I reached my chamber, I found the mirror waiting, placed directly across my bed. In its surface, I saw her standing behind me once more, her hand resting upon my shoulder. Only this time, it was not her reflection that moved. It was mine. I do not recall losing consciousness, though when I woke, the world had rearranged itself. The candle was gone, replaced by a dull orange glow seeping through the cracks of the shutters. Dust swam in the air, moving as if stirred by invisible hands. The mirror across from me stood unbroken, yet it no longer showed the chamber, only a long, windowless hall lit by faint, swaying lamps. The sound in that reflection was muffled, thick, as though carried through water. I rose slowly, though the weight in my limbs was not fatigue but something heavier, dread that had settled into the bone. When I stepped closer to the glass, the figure that should have been my reflection did not mimic me. It stood still, facing the hall within the mirror, waiting. Then, after a pause that felt like years, it began to walk forward, away from me, deeper, into that unseen corridor. At the same moment, I heard the faint sound of steps in the real world, echoing faintly behind the walls, moving in the same rhythm as the figure beyond the glass. I reached out to touch the mirror, and the surface rippled under my fingers like the skin of a pond. Cold bled through my hand, sharp enough to draw blood from the tips of my fingers. When I pulled away, crimson spread across the glass, staining the image within. The figure stopped. It turned slowly, its head moving first, its body following with a strange stiffness, as though the bones did not wish to obey. When its face came into view, I understood what Lady Miriam had meant. The reflection bore my features, but older, hollowed, and terribly familiar. It smiled then, faintly, almost kindly, as if relieved to see me at last. And when it spoke, the sound came from behind me, close enough that I felt the breath on my neck. The debt continues. The words still ring within me, though I cannot say whether they were ever truly spoken. The air in the chamber had turned thick, heavy with that scent again, wax and iron mingled with something like smoke. I turned toward the doorway, but there was none. The walls had sealed themselves, as if the house had decided I was not to leave. The mirror now occupied the whole far wall, stretching floor to ceiling, and in it, the figure, my reflection, my inheritor, stood closer than before. He moved when I did not. Each breath he drew echoed faintly, delayed by a fraction of a heartbeat. When I lifted my hand, he kept his still. When I tried to step back, he advanced. His eyes were not mine. They held that same dull gleam I had seen in Lady Miriam's portrait, the wet shimmer of something that has watched centuries pass in silence. I tried to speak, to ask who he was or what I had become, but my mouth produced no sound. Only a thin trail of air left my lips, and from within the mirror he answered instead, my voice, yet aged, trembling, as though dragged from the throat of an old dying man. "You were never a guest," it said. "You came to take your place." The glass began to hum, a low, continuous tone, rising like a bow drawn across a single violin string. The light in the room flickered and dimmed. I felt something pull at me, not from the outside, but from within, as if my body were loosening its hold on itself. The mirror rippled again, and through that shifting surface I glimpsed faces, dozens of them, pale, solemn, trapped beneath the sheen like insects preserved in amber. At their center stood Lady Miriam. Her eyes were open now, serene, her lips moving without sound. Around her neck hung the same serpent emblem from the Red Book, its coil broken where the tail should meet its mouth. My reflection extended a hand toward me, and this time I did not move away. I felt the glass yield under my touch, soft and cold as breath. The hum deepened. The walls began to shake, and then, from the other side he pulled. I remember the sound, not of shattering, but of surrender. The mirror did not break. It opened, swallowing the room whole. For a brief instant, the world lost its edges. The floor no longer held weight. The air no longer carried breath. All that existed was light, pale, colorless, stretching without end. And in that blinding silence, I felt the grip of another hand closing around mine. It was not cold anymore. It burned. The reflection, my other self, drew me forward, and I passed through the glass as easily as mist. The chamber behind me dissolved into darkness. I stood now in the corridor I had seen in the mirror, narrow, lined with doors that exhaled faint draughts of air, each one marked by the same downward cross. The lamps along the walls flickered weakly, fed by oil that seemed blacker than pitch. I could hear them behind the doors, breathing, weeping, murmuring prayers too old for my tongue, and above it all a voice, soft, commanding, familiar, reciting the same phrase over and over. Sanguis pro sanguine. Each repetition struck like a tolling bell. I followed the sound, though I no longer recall walking. My feet barely touched the ground. The corridor ended in a small chamber, lit by a single flame suspended in air. Beneath it stood Lady Miriam. Her face was unchanged, but her eyes no longer sought the living. In her hands she held a bowl of dark liquid, rippling though no wind stirred. Around her feet were the portraits from the manor walls, their faces restored, their eyes closed in perfect peace. She looked upon me with something like relief. "It is done," she whispered. "The line is preserved, the debt paid forward." Then she lifted the bowl toward me. My reflection, still standing behind her, placed his hand upon my shoulder. The flame dimmed, the walls breathed, and I understood at last what the pact demanded. The blood remembers, and it had found its next vessel. I have tried to forget, but memory has teeth that never dull. Even now, as I write these final words, I feel the weight of the house pressing through the paper, the damp, the breath, the soft pulse that still moves somewhere deep within its walls. They told me years had passed since that autumn, that the Harlow estate lies in ruin now, half swallowed by the marsh. Yet when I close my eyes, I am there again. The corridors curve the same, the air tastes of soot and iron, and the mirror waits, patient as the grave. I left Somerset before winter, or so I believed. My body wandered from that place, but something of me remained. Sometimes, in a still room, I catch the faint hum, that low, trembling note that comes before the pull. I have learned not to answer it. I have learned to keep my mirrors covered, though even then I see movement beneath the cloth. I dream of her often, Lady Miriam standing at the edge of the marsh, her gloved hand resting upon a child's shoulder. The child never turns, never speaks, but I know him. He wears my face, though younger, unmarked. In the dream, she bends to whisper into his ear, and though I cannot hear the words, I know what she says, because the same phrase echoes in my chest when I wake. The blood remembers. The doctors tell me it is guilt or madness, but guilt does not whisper from the glass. Madness does not breathe when the room is still. Last night I heard the sound again, a soft tapping, like fingers brushing against silver. When I looked, the cloth had fallen from the mirror. There was no reflection there, only fog, and within it, the faint outline of a woman waiting. I know now why the faces were erased, why the names were buried. The pact was never to end, only to change its bearer, and as the candle burns low beside me, I see her hand reaching once more through the dimming light. It is gloved, and this time I do not pull away.